The red leather provenance file was still open in Maya Thorne's hands when Julian Thorne signed the final acquisition document. Across the private auction room, applause followed a multi-million-dollar winning bid. Julian stood in a black tailored suit, smiling as the disputed masterpiece was formally transferred. Beside him, Elena Vance glowed in an ivory silk dress, accepting the painting as if it were a crown. Then Julian raised his glass. Maya understands records. Elena understands beauty. He said it softly enough to sound elegant and loudly enough for the collectors to understand the replacement. A few collectors laughed. Several turned toward Maya. No one noticed the highlighted notation inside the red file. The provenance chain attached to the painting had already been flagged for unresolved ownership questions. Maya did not react. She studied the page instead. In that moment, she understood something colder than betrayal. Julian had not simply chosen another woman. He had mistaken value for display. That was the real problem. Then she closed the file. Maya left the auction floor before the celebration reached its peak. No dramatic exit. No confrontation. The gallery corridors were quieter than the room she had just abandoned, lined with works whose histories mattered more than the people currently admiring them. She moved through the secured collection wing and entered a private review office reserved for authentication personnel. The red file remained in her hand. The file stayed red. On the desk sat a terminal connected to the International Provenance Registry, a system Julian barely understood and Elena had probably never heard of. Maya logged in using credentials she had carried for years. Her access reached deeper than any collector's fortune. She opened the disputed record attached to the painting. The ownership concern was still active. The supporting documentation remained incomplete. Several historical transfers required renewed verification. History mattered. Most collectors would have ignored those warnings. Julian certainly had. He believed the winning bid itself created legitimacy. Maya knew legitimacy traveled in the opposite direction. First came proof. Then came value. She reviewed the chain again. Then she reviewed it a third time. Nothing had changed. The risk was real. More importantly, the system allowed a formal reassessment request whenever unresolved provenance issues threatened market confidence. That authority existed to protect cultural history from becoming a luxury costume for the wealthy. Maya understood the rule because she had helped build part of the framework behind it. Julian never cared enough to ask how those protections worked. He only enjoyed the advantages they provided. He had miscalculated. Maya opened a secure submission window. Her finger hovered over the authorization field for several seconds. Not because she doubted the evidence, because she understood what would happen next. Once initiated, the review process would spread through authentication networks, insurers, collectors, archives, and institutions. Questions would begin. Confidence would weaken. The painting would no longer be judged by its purchase price, but by the strength of its documented history. That distinction could change everything. Verify it. Maya entered the authorization code. The request moved into the system. She watched the confirmation appear on the screen. No alarm sounded. No audience witnessed the moment. The world remained exactly as it had been 1 minute earlier. Yet the first move was already irreversible. Maya closed the terminal, secured the red file beneath her arm, and walked toward the exit. Behind her, Julian was still celebrating ownership. Ahead of her, the painting was about to face the only question money could not answer. An hour after submitting the review request, Maya sat alone inside a secured archive facility several miles from the auction house. The room held no luxury and offered no applause. Shelves stretched across the walls, filled with acquisition records, ownership transfers, exhibition catalogs, and forgotten histories. This was where value survived after attention disappeared. The red provenance file rested beside her. The file stayed red. Maya opened it again and slowly turned to the earliest documentation connected to the painting Julian had purchased. The records traced decades of ownership, legal transfers, restoration notes, and private collections. Some of the signatures belonged to people long gone. Some institutions no longer existed. Yet their records remained. Their decisions still mattered. She studied each page carefully. Then she stopped. A handwritten notation from years earlier sat near the margin of a preservation report. Maya remembered reading it for the first time long before she married Julian. Back then she had admired the painting because it carried a story larger than any buyer. It represented stewardship, not possession. That memory settled heavily across the room. Then she understood. The deepest wound had nothing to do with Elena. Elena was simply the latest audience member in a performance Julian had been perfecting for years. The real injury was quieter. Julian had stood beside Maya through countless dinners, private viewings, and collector events. He had listened while she explained provenance, authenticity, and cultural responsibility. He had nodded. He had asked questions. He had repeated her language in public. Maya once believed that meant respect. Sitting alone among the archives, she finally accepted a harder truth. He had learned enough to borrow her credibility. That realization hurt more than Elena. Elena had never built anything Maya cared about. Julian had. Then he handed it away. He had never cared enough to understand it. That was different. She looked back at the ownership records. The painting was not valuable because wealthy people wanted it. It was valuable because generations had protected its story. Julian had reduced that story to a gift for Elena. A decoration. A symbol of status. A social accessory wrapped in a ribbon of money. That realization hurt more than any affair. Then she closed the folder for a moment and leaned back in silence. No tears came. None were necessary. She was not grieving the loss of a husband. She was grieving the collapse of an illusion. For years she believed she was building a life with someone who respected truth. Instead, she had been protecting a man who only respected outcomes. That was the breaking point. Not anger. Clarity. Maya reopened the file and reviewed her own position. The International Authentication Network still trusted her judgment. The registry still recognized her authority. Her professional relationships remained intact. The historical archives remained accessible. Most importantly, the review process was already moving through channels Julian could not control. She still possessed the one asset he could never purchase. Credibility. Preserve that. Maya gathered several supporting records and prepared additional documentation for the review panel. Every page strengthened the chain of evidence. Every record narrowed the space available for illusion. By the time she secured the file and prepared to leave, her pain had already transformed into structure. Julian still believed ownership created value. Maya now understood that belief would become his greatest liability. So she moved. The review process began long before the public noticed it. That was the nature of authentication. People imagined value was created in auction rooms, collector dinners, and glossy magazine profiles. In reality, value was usually determined in quieter places. Archive vaults, insurance reviews, preservation records, authentication committees. Maya understood that ecosystem better than almost anyone. 3 days after the auction, she arrived at a restricted research facility carrying the red provenance file beneath her arm. The file stayed red. Inside a private records chamber, she assembled a complete chain of documentation connected to the disputed painting. Ownership transfers, restoration certifications, export permits, estate records, exhibition histories. Every document told part of a story. Every missing document created risk. She wasn't building an attack. She was rebuilding the truth. Verify the chain. Maya submitted additional supporting materials to the International Review Panel overseeing the reassessment. The process followed strict protocols. Independent reviewers examined inconsistencies. Historical records were compared against existing registrations. Insurance databases were cross-checked. Private collection histories were verified. The system moved slowly by design because accuracy mattered more than speed. That patience frustrated wealthy buyers. It protected everyone else. As the review advanced, Maya noticed a pattern she had seen many times throughout her career. People with genuine expertise rarely demanded recognition. People desperate for recognition usually revealed themselves without realizing it. Julian belonged firmly to the second category. Across the city, he was enjoying the attention generated by his purchase. Luxury publications featured photographs of him beside the painting. Interviews followed. Invitations multiplied. Elena appeared beside him in nearly every image. But Elena did not merely pose beside the painting. She began explaining it. In one luxury magazine profile, she called the acquisition a triumph of instinct over paperwork. Then she added, "Some people need files to understand beauty. I just feel it." The quote spread quickly through collector circles. Julian approved it because it flattered the story he wanted. Maya saved it because it revealed the lie. Yet Maya paid little attention to the photographs themselves. She watched the interviews. That was where the useful information lived. During one conversation with a lead journalist, Julian spent several minutes describing the cultural significance of the acquisition. He repeated phrases Maya had once used in private discussions. He referenced stewardship, legacy, historical preservation. The language sounded familiar because it was. But then the journalist asked a simple question about the painting's ownership history before its emergence on the modern market. Julian redirected the conversation almost immediately. Maya noticed it. So did others. He had no interest in understanding history. He only wanted to own the appearance of understanding. There it was. Another interview produced a similar result. When asked why the acquisition mattered personally, Julian spoke at length about influence, cultural leadership, and shaping public taste. He spoke very little about the artwork itself. Maya watched the recording twice. Then she archived it. Preserve that. The deeper issue was becoming clearer. Julian's weakness had never been greed. It was insecurity, disguised as confidence. Wealth opened doors for him, but respect remained uncertain. He collected visible symbols of legitimacy because he feared he did not possess legitimacy on his own. Maya had spent years unknowingly helping him bridge that gap. Her expertise made him appear informed. Her reputation made him appear trusted. Her presence made him appear accepted by people whose approval he desperately wanted. Now those protections were gone. The review process continued moving forward. Additional institutions requested documentation. More questions entered the record. Nothing dramatic happened. No headlines exploded. No accusations were issued. The system simply kept asking for evidence. And evidence was the one thing confidence could not replace. As Maya secured another collection of records and transmitted them to the review panel, she understood that the reassessment was no longer just about a painting. It was becoming a test of whether reputation could survive without truth standing behind it. Julian still believed attention was power. Maya knew attention was temporary. Verification lasted longer. That was enough. Power isn't found in the frame. It's found in the history that the buyer was too arrogant to read. There are people who spend their lives trying to own beautiful things, and there are people who spend their lives understanding why those things matter. The difference seems small until pressure arrives. Then it becomes everything. Julian believed ownership gave him authority. Maya had once believed knowledge would naturally earn respect. Both assumptions were being tested. The strange thing about betrayal is that it often reveals a structure that was already there. The injury does not create the truth. It exposes it. Maya understood that now. Looking back, she could see how often Julian had borrowed certainty from her expertise while presenting confidence as his own. She could see how easily society rewarded appearance over substance. Most importantly, she could see that her silence had helped sustain an illusion she no longer wished to protect. That realization did not make her bitter. It made her accurate. Accuracy changed everything. Several days later, Maya stepped into a secured authentication center operated by an international consortium of archives, insurers, museums, and preservation institutions. The building carried none of the glamour associated with elite galleries. There were no collectors competing for attention, no luxury photographers, no social media broadcasts. The rooms were filled with records, conservation reports, legal histories, and specialists who spent their careers protecting facts from fashionable narratives. Maya belonged here. A red conference credential rested against her blazer as she entered a restricted review chamber. The red provenance file remained with her. The file stayed red. Around a long table, authentication reviewers examined supplemental documentation connected to the disputed painting. Maya was not there to control the outcome. The system prohibited that. She was there to ensure every available record entered the review process. That distinction mattered. Truth required structure. One reviewer requested historical transfer records from a private estate. Another questioned a gap in documentation that stretched back decades. A third identified inconsistencies between catalog references and export filings. None of these issues proved misconduct. Yet together they created uncertainty. And uncertainty was dangerous in the art world. Preserve the record. Maya supplied additional supporting materials and watched the review continue. Across the following days, requests spread beyond the original panel. Insurance carriers sought clarification. Collection managers asked questions. Institutional lenders reviewed exposure risks. Quiet conversations began moving through circles that rarely attracted public attention. The painting's story was becoming more important than its price. Meanwhile, Maya learned that Julian had accepted an invitation to speak at a prestigious collector symposium. The timing was almost perfect. While authentication experts searched for evidence, Julian was preparing to present himself as a leading voice in cultural investment. Maya studied the announcement carefully. He wasn't promoting a painting. He was promoting himself. There it was again. The same hunger hidden beneath the confidence. The same need to belong among people whose approval still mattered to him. Maya placed the announcement beside the authentication records and immediately recognized the collision approaching from opposite directions. One side relied on visibility. The other relied on verification. Visibility moved quickly. Verification moved slowly. But verification had a habit of surviving long after attention disappeared. Then she filed another document. The review process expanded. The questions multiplied. And for the first time since leaving the auction house, Maya sensed the balance of power beginning to shift away from spectacle and back toward substance. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough to matter. From the outside, Julian Thorne appeared to be winning. The headlines were favorable. The photographs were flawless. Invitations continued arriving from collector circles, private foundations, and luxury cultural events. The disputed painting remained displayed inside a carefully controlled exhibition space, and Elena Vance seemed determined to transform every public appearance into proof that they belonged at the center of the art world. In many ways, they looked exactly like the future they wanted everyone else to see. Appearances mattered. Elena arrived at each event in elegant ivory ensembles that reinforced her carefully curated image. She spoke confidently about culture, influence, and artistic appreciation. Luxury publications quoted her observations. Social media accounts praised her sophistication. The painting appeared behind her so often that it began functioning less like a work of art and more like a stage prop supporting a personal brand. Julian encouraged it. He enjoyed the attention. More importantly, he enjoyed what the attention seemed to imply. Recognition, validation, acceptance. The things money could purchase indirectly if displayed correctly. Across the city, Maya monitored developments from a distance. She had no interest in competing for visibility. Her work remained focused on the authentication review, which continued expanding through professional channels. Additional inquiries had been filed. Historical records were still being evaluated. The process remained confidential, but its influence was growing. Quietly, methodically, that was enough. One afternoon, Julian appeared as a featured speaker at a collector symposium attended by investors, curators, and cultural patrons. The audience was precisely the type he preferred. People whose approval carried social value. People who influenced reputations. People who could transform wealth into status. Julian stepped onto the stage wearing a black suit and spoke about stewardship, legacy, and the responsibility of preserving cultural treasures. The language sounded polished. Familiar, even. Maya watched a recording later that evening. Several of his phrases echoed conversations she had once shared with him privately. He had always been a quick learner when the lesson improved his image. Yet something unexpected happened during the question session. A foundation chair asked about the painting's authentication review. The question itself was polite. The room remained respectful. But Julian's answer changed immediately. His confidence tightened. His smile became more deliberate. He dismissed the review as a routine procedural matter and redirected the conversation toward market demand. Most people probably missed it. Maya did not. Neither did several professionals in attendance. There it was. A small fracture. Not fear of financial loss. Fear of doubt. Julian could tolerate criticism from competitors. He struggled with skepticism from people whose respect he wanted. The distinction mattered. Later that week, another interview created a similar moment. A lead journalist referenced the ongoing review and asked whether authentication concerns affected his confidence in the acquisition. Julian answered quickly. Too quickly. He emphasized the purchase price. He emphasized expert advisors. He emphasized market interest. What he never emphasized was evidence. Maya replayed the interview once before closing the screen. He still believed ownership validated value. He still believed confidence could substitute for certainty. More revealingly, he needed everyone else to believe it too. The false advantage remained intact. For now, the invitations continued. The photographs continued. The admiration continued. But beneath the surface, Julian was beginning to reveal something he spent years trying to hide. He did not merely want to own great art. He wanted great art to prove he deserved a seat among those who understood it. That hunger remained invisible to most people. Not to Maya. She recognized it because she had spent years helping him conceal it. Now the concealment was ending. Slowly, carefully, inevitably. The shift did not begin with a scandal. It began with paperwork. That was how most systems corrected themselves. Not through dramatic announcements, but through questions that refused to disappear. 2 weeks after the collector symposium, the authentication review entered a more visible stage. Additional documentation requests moved through institutional channels. Insurance underwriters sought clarification regarding exposure risks connected to the painting. Collection lenders requested updates. Several archival organizations quietly reopened historical records connected to the disputed ownership chain. None of those actions accused anyone of wrongdoing. Yet each one created friction. And friction had a way of slowing momentum. Maya watched the process unfold from inside the authentication network. The red provenance file remained on her desk, growing thicker as supporting materials accumulated. The file stayed red. Every new record strengthened the same principle. Value depended on trust. Trust depended on evidence. Preserve the chain. Across the market, subtle reactions began appearing. A collector who had expressed interest in a future acquisition postponed discussions. A private exhibition partner requested additional assurances before featuring the painting. An insurer delayed finalizing a valuation update until the review reached a conclusion. Small decisions, reasonable decisions, professional decisions. Yet together they formed a pattern. The system was beginning to turn. Then the first visible refusal arrived. A museum curator withdrew the painting from a planned private exhibition and sent only one sentence. We cannot display a work under unresolved. Authentication review. Julian read the message twice. Julian noticed the delays almost immediately. He was accustomed to movement. Approvals. Invitations. Expansions. His world operated on acceleration. The appearance of hesitation unsettled him more than open opposition would have. During a meeting with the investor relations officer overseeing the family art fund, he received a routine update regarding market concerns. The language remained polite, professional, neutral. The officer explained that several stakeholders wanted clarity before increasing exposure to assets connected with ongoing authentication reviews. Julian dismissed the concern publicly. Later, he requested a second briefing, then a third. Questions that once seemed insignificant suddenly demanded attention. Read the record. Elena encountered similar resistance. Several luxury campaigns continued without interruption, but new opportunities slowed. One partnership requested additional due diligence before moving forward. Another postponed an announcement involving the painting. Publicly, she described the changes as scheduling adjustments. Privately, uncertainty began creeping into conversations she preferred to avoid. The painting was no longer functioning as a flawless symbol. Beneath Elena's latest promotional post, the comments changed. Not hostile. Informed. Has the provenance review been completed? Who verified the chain? Why are institutions asking questions? The image remained beautiful. The certainty was gone. It had become a question mark. Meanwhile, within professional circles, the discussion evolved beyond a single artwork. Experts began examining the broader implications of provenance verification. Industry publications published thoughtful articles about authentication standards and historical accountability. No one focused exclusively on Julian. That made the development even more dangerous. The conversation was becoming larger than his influence, larger than his money, larger than his image. Maya understood the significance immediately. When systems become focused on principles instead of personalities, control becomes difficult to recover. Verification was no longer a private review. It was becoming part of a broader professional conversation. And professional conversations had long memories. One evening, Julian appeared on a cultural investment panel and attempted to project confidence. The audience remained attentive. The questions remained courteous. Yet when a moderator referenced the importance of provenance transparency, something changed. Julian answered correctly. The words were accurate. But the response felt rehearsed. Defensive. For a brief moment, he sounded less like an authority and more like a man trying to protect authority. Maya noticed it while reviewing the recording later that night. Others would notice soon enough. The system was not attacking him. That was the mistake he continued making. Systems do not seek revenge. Systems seek verification. And verification was steadily removing the advantages that image alone had once provided. The invitations still arrived. The photographs still circulated. The appearance of success remained intact. But beneath the surface, confidence was beginning to depend on answers Julian could not manufacture. That distinction was becoming impossible to ignore. He did not know it yet, but the market had already started asking a question money could not answer for him. The official review findings were not catastrophic. That was the problem. Many people expected collapse to arrive as a dramatic event. Instead, the authentication panel issued a carefully worded determination that the painting's provenance contained unresolved ownership questions significant enough to prevent full authentication until additional evidence could be produced. The language was professional, restrained, precise. Yet within the art world, the consequences were immediate. A painting did not need to be declared fraudulent to lose power. It only needed uncertainty attached to its story. Once uncertainty entered the record, confidence began leaving the room. Then everything changed. Insurance valuations were revised. An insurer suspended the enhanced valuation pending review. One page, one signature. Millions in perceived value disappeared without anyone raising a voice. Exhibition opportunities were reconsidered. Several institutions quietly removed the painting from future planning discussions. Collectors who once competed for proximity now preferred distance. Nobody attacked Julian publicly. Nobody needed to. The system had already spoken. Maya read the determination inside the authentication center and closed the report without celebration. The red provenance file remained beside her. The file stayed red. She had not created the uncertainty. She had only refused to hide it. Across the city, Julian experienced something far more unsettling than criticism. He experienced neutrality. For years, conversations had begun the moment he entered a room. Invitations arrived before he requested them. Doors opened before he reached them. That rhythm had become normal. Now it was changing. At a private collector reception, several conversations ended politely before becoming meaningful. His place card had been moved 3 seats farther from the foundation chair. Nobody explained it. The event coordinator simply smiled with professional calm and guided him to the new position. A foundation chair who once sought his opinion spent most of the evening speaking with other guests. An investor excused himself after a brief greeting and never returned. The difference was subtle, impossible to prove, impossible to ignore. Julian noticed every second of it. Respect had become conditional. One afternoon, he met with the private banker who managed several relationships connected to the art fund. In previous years, recommendations flowed easily. This meeting felt different. The banker remained courteous, but the enthusiasm was gone. The language was measured. The tone was careful. Every answer sounded professionally detached. Julian left frustrated without being able to identify a single offensive remark. That was the point. The loyalty had not disappeared. It had simply become transactional again. Read that carefully. Elena felt the shift as well. A luxury campaign quietly selected another ambassador. A publication reduced coverage. Invitations arrived less frequently than before. For the first time, she asked questions about the review process instead of dismissing it. Her concern was not the painting. It was what the painting represented. Status, access, visibility. Maya had predicted this weeks earlier. Elena stopped asking whether the painting was safe. She started asking how long her name would remain attached to it. That was when Julian understood the admiration he had chosen was also calculating its exit. Meanwhile, the most painful realization arrived for Julian in places no report could document. He watched interviews discussing authentication standards and heard experts speak with admiration about the professionals protecting cultural history. Maya's name surfaced repeatedly, not because she sought attention, because people trusted her judgment. There it was, the wound he had spent years hiding. Julian could tolerate losing value. He struggled to tolerate comparison. Every mention of Maya reminded him that respect followed her naturally, while he spent fortunes trying to purchase a version of it. The truth had begun surfacing, not through accusations, through contrast. He remembered the auction night and suddenly saw it differently. Elena had admired the purchase. Maya had understood the painting. Those were not the same thing. For the first time, that distinction frightened him. The crack widened. The people around him were not abandoning him dramatically. They were doing something worse. They were recalculating him. For the first time, Julian wondered whether the room had ever belonged to him at all. Julian requested the meeting through professional channels, not personal ones. That detail alone revealed how much had changed. Months earlier, he would have assumed access. Now he waited for approval. Maya accepted the request and selected the location herself. The meeting would take place inside a private documentation room attached to the International Authentication Center. No luxury displays. No collectors. No photographers. No audience. Just records. History. Evidence. The things Julian had spent years treating as supporting actors in a story where he believed he was the lead. Maya arrived first. A red blazer rested sharply against her shoulders. The red provenance file sat on the table beside her. The file stayed red. Through a glass partition, shelves filled with preservation archives stretched into the distance. Every document represented a fact that survived fashion. That felt appropriate. Julian entered several minutes later wearing a dark charcoal suit. He looked composed. Successful men often learn how to perform composure even when certainty has disappeared. Yet Maya noticed the hesitation immediately. His movements were slower. His confidence required more effort. The room no longer belonged to him. Neither did the conversation. Julian began carefully. He spoke about misunderstandings, market reactions, public narratives. He argued that the situation had grown larger than necessary. He suggested that authentication findings could be interpreted differently. He discussed reputational damage affecting investors and institutions. At no point did he challenge the evidence itself. He understood that would fail. Instead, he focused on consequences. Then he made the request. Not directly. Never directly. He asked whether additional clarification could be provided, whether language might be softened, whether ongoing uncertainty could be resolved through collaboration. The wording remained professional. The meaning was simple. He wanted Maya to help restore confidence. Maya listened without interruption. When he finished, silence settled across the room. Not an uncomfortable silence. A useful one. Then she opened the file. Read page 12. Julian looked down. The page contained one of the earliest records associated with the disputed ownership chain. A historical notation. A preservation concern. A warning that had existed long before the auction. Long before Elena. Long before the headlines. Maya waited until he finished reading. Then she spoke. Her voice remained calm. You never wanted to own great art, Julian. You wanted great art to convince people you belonged in the room. That's why you could spend millions buying a painting, but you never learned why it was valuable. Maya let the silence settle. The collectors respected my judgment. You thought they respected your wealth. Those were never the same thing. The words landed harder than any accusation. Because they were. Accurate. Julian said nothing. Maya continued. She explained what he had spent years refusing to see. He believed the purchase created legitimacy. He believed attention created authority. He believed proximity to expertise was the same thing as expertise itself. You borrowed my credibility and called it your taste. You weren't rejected because you lacked money. You were exposed because you mistook admiration for trust. Every decision flowed from that misunderstanding. Elena had never been the cause. She was evidence. Evidence of the kind of admiration he preferred. Admiration that required no understanding. Admiration that never challenged him. Maya closed the file. You weren't competing with me, she said quietly. You were competing with the fact that people trusted me without needing a price attached to the trust. For the first time, Julian had no response prepared. The wound was fully exposed now. Not financial loss. Not market pressure. Fear. Fear that the respect surrounding Maya had always been genuine while his own depended on performance. Fear that the people he wanted to impress had known the difference all along. The realization settled visibly across his face. Then Maya stood. No anger. No victory speech. No negotiation. She gathered the red provenance file and moved toward the door. Before leaving, she offered one final truth. Authentication doesn't exist to protect wealth. It exists to protect reality. Then she walked away. Julian remained alone among records he could not influence, histories he could not purchase, and facts that no longer required his permission to exist. The most expensive asset in a gallery isn't the painting on the wall, but the signature that confirms it actually exists. That truth sounds simple until someone spends a lifetime trying to replace it with money. People often imagine power as something visible. A title, a fortune, a headline, a seat at an exclusive table. Yet the strongest forms of power are usually quieter than that. Trust is quiet. Credibility is quiet. Expertise is quiet. They do not need constant attention because they continue working long after attention moves elsewhere. Maya Thorne learned that lesson in the most painful way possible. She was not broken by the affair. She was not broken by public humiliation. She was not broken by watching another woman receive something she valued. What changed her was discovering that the person closest to her never truly understood the thing she had dedicated her life to protecting. Once she accepted that truth, she stopped trying to earn recognition from someone incapable of giving it. Everything became clearer after that. Several months later, the International Art Summit opened before an audience of preservation leaders, museum directors, authentication specialists, collectors, and cultural institutions from around the world. Maya stood on the main stage wearing a tailored red suit. Around her were not investors chasing headlines or influencers chasing attention. These were people committed to protecting cultural memory. That difference mattered. Behind her, a large display introduced a new independent preservation and provenance foundation dedicated to strengthening authentication standards, protecting ownership histories, and supporting transparent stewardship across the art world. Maya had spent months building it, not as an act of revenge, as an act of responsibility. Build something better. The audience listened as she spoke about trust, evidence, and the obligation to preserve truth even when truth becomes inconvenient. Her words carried weight because they came from experience rather than performance. No one needed to wonder whether she belonged in the room. The room already knew. Across the summit hall, several investors gathered around Julian. Their conversation remained civil, professional, yet the dynamic had changed completely. They were no longer asking him to define the future. They were asking him to explain the past. The distinction was impossible to miss. Elena had long since shifted her attention toward newer opportunities and different circles. The admiration Julian once depended on had proven less permanent than he imagined. Maya did not watch. She had no reason to. The final victory was not seeing him diminished. The final victory was no longer needing his validation to measure her worth. Later that afternoon, after the summit concluded, Maya entered the Foundation's first archive room. It was not grand. It was quiet, climate-controlled, and nearly empty. A single shelf had been prepared at the front of the room. The brass plate beneath it read, Archive Record 001. Maya placed the red provenance file there herself. Once, the file had carried the proof of betrayal. Now it marked the beginning of preservation. She closed the file. She left the archive door open behind her. Her future no longer required permission. This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, reflection, and educational purposes. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental.